Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and I'm here to read. Now, usually we read this story and then we discuss it, but this is the last story that we're going to do before summer break, so I wanted to do something that is a little lighter, this one is not totally light because there's a funeral involved, but I'm not going to intentionally do like ASMR, but it is very much kind of a just nice pastoral sort of story. And this story is not really one that you can spoil per se, so I'm not too concerned about talking about it before we read the story. The story is by Sarah Orne Jewett. We love Sarah Orne Jewett on this channel because she's very much an emblematic part of the American Literary Regionalist movement. We love American Literary Regionalism on the channel because it very much centers around the struggle and the hardship and the joy and the uniqueness of a particular region of America, which is very much embodied by this piece, which takes a very close look at the interconnected lives of people living on the White Rose Road in the middle of Maine. It's a very rural area. I can't say rural very well and easily. Rural? I don't know why that's such a struggle. But a lot of Sarah's work is very much wrapped up in the experiences of people living away from the cities in Maine. So it should be noted that this is it's not completely non-fictionalized, but it's very close to being autobiographical, something that Sarah just went and did. This is an actual road in Maine. It's not called the White Rose Road, it's called something else, and you can see her actual path that she took, see the homesteads of the people that she met, and she went ahead and submitted it to Atlantic Magazine, which is where most of her work was published, and then it was published again in her Strangers and Wayfarers short story compilation in 1890. So Sarah knew how to grow a rosebush. Like, she knew how to propagate roses. You get the one that you want, and then you take cuttings, and then from there you can graft it, or you can root the cuttings, or that's kind of irrelevant. But there are tons of rose bushes near these homesteads, and it seems like they all have arisen from the same rootstock. It's basically the same plant, but they've just taken cuttings and brought them back and forth between one another as a show of friendship, as a show of neighborliness. Is that a word? And so that is kind of a really great symbol in a lot of ways of the rural lifestyle. I still can't say rural. But that's just something to keep in mind as we read the story, is this idea of the same but different. At one point she talks about this southern garden, and she draws a very close parallel between the White Rose Road and this different southern garden in this kind of like, we're not all that different. And of course the enduring symbolism of a rose, which is a beautiful short-lived flower that has thorns for defense. You know, the rose and the thorn. There's this sense of being built upon the traditions of the past, and yet the tearing down of those traditions simultaneously. But there's also this sense of how our traditions will necessarily affect the traditions of others and tear those down as well. Like, at one point she talks about the natives and how they used to use the land and how different it was from the current traditions, how these families have lived in these farmsteads, which they have won by cutting down all the trees, and how as the tradition of these farmers have come to pass, the tradition of the natives have kind of encroached back as the forests have come back. In certain points, she actually kind of rails against progress and how that has adversely affected the rural area, but specifically she talks about the fish. And that to me is super interesting because aside from like, oh, we were in a horse and buggy, this feels so familiar to me with my own, wanderings across the more rural, less developed areas of America. If you have spent any time in the countryside, let me know if this resonates with you as well, because it felt so familiar to me in so many ways. The White Rose Road by Sarah Orne Jewett. Being a New Englander, it is natural that I should first speak about the weather. Only the middle of June, the green fields and blue sky and bright sun, with a touch of northern mountain wind blowing straight toward the sea, could make such a day, and that is all one can say about it. We were driving seaward through a part of the country which has been least changed in the last 30 years, among farms which have been won from swampy lowland and rocky stump-buttressed hillsides, where the forests wall in the fields and send their outposts year by year farther into the pastures. There is a year or two in the history of these pastures before they have arrived at the dignity of being called woodland, and yet are too much shaded and overgrown by young trees to give proper pasturage, when they made delightful harbors for the small wild creatures which yet remain, and for wild flowers and berries. Here you send an astonished rabbit scurrying to his burrow, and there you startle yourself with a partridge, who seems to get the best of the encounter. Sometimes you see a hen partridge and her brood of chickens crossing your path with an air of comfortable dooryard security. As you drive along the narrow, grassy road, you see many charming sights and delightful nooks on either hand, where the young trees spring out of a close-cropped turf that carpets the ground like velvet. Toward the east and the quaint fishing village of Ongenquit, I find the most delightful woodland roads. There is little left of the large timber which once filled the region, but much young growth, and there are hundreds of acres of cleared land and pasture ground where forests are springing fast and covering the country once more, as if they had no idea of losing in their war with civilization and the intruding white settler. The pine woods and the Indians seem to be next of kin, and the former owners of this corner of New England are the only proper figures to paint into such landscapes. The twilight under tall pines seems to be untenanted, and to lack something at first sight, as if one opened the door of an empty house. A farmer passing through with his axe is but an intruder, and children straying home from school give one a feeling of solicitude at their unprotectedness. The pine woods are the red man's house, and it may be hazardous even yet for the Graham farmhouses to stand so near the eaves of the forest. I have noticed a distrust of the deep woods among elderly people, which was something more than a fear of losing their way. It was a feeling of defenselessness against some unrecognized but malicious influence. Driving through the long woodland way, shaded and chilly when you are out of the sun, across the great Works River and its pretty elm-grown intervale, across the short bridges of brown brooks, delayed now and then by the sight of ripe strawberries in sunny spots by the roadside, one comes to a higher open country where farm joins farm, and the cleared fields lie all along the highway, while the woods are pushed back a good distance on either hand. The wooded hills, bleak here and there with granite ledges, rise beyond. The houses are beside the road, with green dooryards and large barns, almost empty now, and with wide doors standing open, as if they were already expecting the hay crop to be brought in. The tall green grass is waving in the fields as the wind goes over, and there is a fragrance of whiteweed and ripe strawberries and clover blowing through the sunshiny barns, with their lean sides and their festoons of brown dusty cobwebs, Dull, comfortable creatures they appear to imaginative eyes, waiting hungrily for their yearly meal. The eave swallows are teasing their sleepy shapes, like the birds which flit about great beasts. Gay, movable, irreverent, almost derisive, those barn swallows fly to and fro in the clear, still air. The noise of our wheels brings fewer faces to the windows than usual, and we lose the pleasure of seeing some of our friends who are apt to be looking out, and to whom we like to say good day. Some funeral must be taking place, or perhaps the women may have gone out into the fields. It is hoeing time and strawberry time, and already we have seen some of the younger women at work among the corn and potatoes. One sight will be charming to remember. On a green hillside sloping to the west, near one of the houses, a thin little girl was working away lustily with a big hoe on a patch of land perhaps 50 feet by 20. There were all sorts of things growing there, as if a child's fancy had made the choice. Straight rows of turnips and carrots and beets, a little of everything, one might say. But the only touch of color was from a long border of useful sage in full bloom of dull blue on the upper side. I am sure this was called Katie's or Becky's piece by elder members of the family. One can imagine how the young creature had planned it in the spring and persuaded the men to plow and harrow it, and since then had stoutly done all the work herself, and meant to send the harvest of the piece to market, and pocket her honest gains as they came in, for some great end. She was as thin as a grasshopper, this busy little gardener, and hardly turned to give us a glance as we drove slowly up the hill close by. The sun will brown and dry her like a spear of grass on that hot slope, but a spark of fine spirit is in the small body, and I wish her a famous crop. I hate to say that the piece looked backward, all except the sage, and that it was a heavy bit of land for the clumsy hoe to pick at. The only puzzle is what she proposes to do with so long a row of sage. Yet there may be a large family with a downfall of measles yet ahead, and she does not mean to be caught without sage tea. Along this road, every one of the old farmhouses has at least one tall bush of white roses by the door. A most lovely sight, with buds and blossoms and unvexed green leaves. I wish that I knew the history of them, and whence the first bush was brought. Perhaps from England itself, like a red rose that I know in Kittery, and the new shoots from the root were given to one neighbor after another all through the district. The bushes are slender, but they grow tall without climbing against the wall, and sway to and fro in the wind with a grace of youth and an inexpressible charm of beauty. How many lovers must have picked them on Sunday evenings in all the bygone years, and carried them along the roads or by the pasture footpaths, hiding them clumsily under their Sunday coats if they caught sight of anyone coming. Here, too, where the sea wind nips many a young life before its prime, how often the white roses have been put into paler hands and withered there. In spite of the serene and placid look of the old houses, one who has always known them cannot help thinking of the sorrows of these farms and their almost undiverted toil. Near the little gardener's plot, we turned from the main road and drove through lately cleared woodland up to an old farmhouse, high on a ledgy hill, whence there is a fine view of the country seaward and mountainward. There were few of the once large household left there. Only the old farmer, who was crippled by war wounds, active, cheerful man that he was once, and 2 young orphan children. There has been much hard work spent on the place. Every generation has toiled from youth to age without being able to make much beyond a living. The dollars that can be saved are but few, and sickness and death have often brought their bitter cost. The mistress of the farm was helpless for many years. Through all the summers and winters she sat in her pillowed rocking chair in the plain room. She could watch the seldom visited lane, and beyond it, a little way across the fields, were the woods. Besides these, only clouds in the sky. She could not lift her food to her mouth. She could not be her husband's working partner. She never went into another woman's house to see her works and ways, but sat there, aching and tired, vexed by fleas and by heat, and isolated in long storms. Yet the whole countryside neighbored her with true affection. Her spirit grew stronger as her body grew weaker, and the doctors, who grieved because they could do so little with their skill, were never confronted by that malady of the spirit, a desire for ease and laziness, which makes the soundest of bodies useless and complaining. The thought of her blooms in one's mind like the whitest of flowers. It makes one braver and more thankful to remember the simple faith and patience with which she bore her pain and trouble. How often she must have said, "I wish I could do something for you in return," when she was doing 1,000 times more than if, like her neighbors, she followed the simply round of daily life. She was doing constant kindness by her example, but nobody can tell the woe of her long days and nights, the solitude of her spirit, as she was being lifted by such hard ways to the knowledge of higher truth and experience. Think of her pain when, one after another, her children fell ill and died, and she could not tend them. And now, in the same worn chair where she lived and slept, sat her husband, helpless too, thinking of her and missing her more than if she had been sometimes away from home, like other women. Even a stranger would miss her in the house. There sat the old farmer, looking down the lane in his turn, bearing his afflictions with a patient sternness that may have been born of watching his wife's serenity. There was a half-withered rose lying within his reach. Some days nobody came up the lane, and the wild birds that ventured near the house and the clouds that blew over were his only entertainment. He had a fine face of the older New England type, clean-shaven and strong-featured, a type that is fast passing away. He might have been a Cumberland dalesman, such were his dignity and self-possession and English soberness of manner. His large frame was built for hard work, for lifting great weights and pushing his plow through new-cleared land. We felt at home together, and each knew many things that the other did of earlier days, and of losses that had come with time. I remembered coming to the old house often in my childhood. It was in this very farm lane that I first saw anemones and learned what to call them. After we drove away, this crippled man must have thought a long time about my elders and betters, as if he were reading their story out of a book. I suppose he has hauled many a stick of timber pine down for shipyards, and gone through the village so early in the winter morning that I, waking in my warm bed, only heard the sleds creak through the frozen snow as the slow oxen plodded by. Near the house, a trout brook comes plashing over the ledges. At one place there is a most exquisite waterfall to which neither painter's brush nor writer's pen can do justice. The sunlight falls through flickering leaves into the deep glen and makes the foam whiter and the brook more golden brown. You can hear the merry noise of it all night, all day in the house. A little way above the farmstead it comes through marshy ground, which I fear has been the cause of much illness and sorrow to the poor troubled family. I had a thrill of pain, as it seemed to me that the brook was mocking all that trouble with all its wild carelessness and loud laughter as it hurried away down the glen. When we had said good-bye and were turning the horses away, there suddenly appeared in a footpath that led down from one of the green hills the young grandchild, just coming home from school. She was as quick as a bird and as shy in her little pink gown and balanced herself on one foot like a flower. The brother was the elder of the two orphans. He was the old man's delight and dependence by day while his hired man was afield. The sober country boy had learned to wait and tend, and the young people were indeed a joy in that lonely household. There was no sign that they ever played like other children. No truckle cart in the yard, no doll, no bits of broken crockery on order in a rock. They had learned a fashion of life from their elders, and already could lift and carry their share of the burdens of life. It was a country of wild flowers. The last of the columbines were clinging to the hillsides. Down in the small fenced meadows belonging to the farm were meadow rue, just coming in flower, and red and white clover. The golden buttercups were thicker than the grass, while many mulleins were standing straight and slender among the pine stumps with their first blossoms atop. Rudbeckias had found their way in, and appeared more than ever like bold foreigners. Their names should be translated into country speech, and the children ought to call them Rude Beckies, by way of relating them to Bouncing Bets and Sweet Williams. The pasture grass was thick and green after the plentiful rains, and the busy cattle took little notice of us as they browsed steadily and tinkled their pleasant bells. Looking off, the smooth round back of Great Hill caught the sunlight with its fields of young grain, and all the long wooded slopes and valleys were fresh and fair in the June weather, away toward the blue New Hampshire hills on the northern horizon. Seaward stood Agamenticus, dark with its pitch pines, and the far sea itself, blue and calm, ruled the uneven country with its unchangeable line. Out on the white rose road again, we saw more of the rose trees than ever, and now and then a carefully tended flower garden, always delightful to see and think about. These are not made by merely looking through a florist's catalogue and ordering this or that new seedling and a proper selection of bulbs and shrubs. Everything in a country garden has its history and personal association. The old bushes, the perennials, are apt to have the most tender relationship with the hands that planted them long ago. There is a constant exchange of such treasures between the neighbors, and in spring the slips and cuttings may be seen rooting on the window ledges, while the houseplants give endless work all winter long, since they need careful protection against frost in long nights of the severe weather. A flower-loving woman brings back from every one of her infrequent journeys some treasure of flower seeds or a huge miscellaneous nosegay. Time to work in the little plot of pleasure ground is hardly won by the busy mistress of the farmhouse. The most appealing collection of flowering plants and vines that I ever saw was in Virginia, once, above the exquisite valley spanned by the Natural Bridge, a valley far too little known or praised. I had noticed an old log house as I learned to know the outlook from the picturesque hotel, and was sure that it must give a charming view from its perch on the summit of a hill. One day I went there, one April day, when the whole landscape was full of color from the budding trees, and before I could look at the view, I caught sight of some rare vines already in leaf about the dilapidated walls of the cabin. Then, across the low paling, I saw the brilliant colors of tulips and daffodils. There were many rose bushes. In fact, the whole top of the hill was a flower garden, once well cared for and carefully ordered. It was all the work of an old woman of Scotch-Irish descent, who had been busy with the cares of her life and a very hard worker. Yet I was told that to gratify her love of flowers, she would often go afoot many miles over those rough Virginia roads with a root or cutting from her own garden to barter for a new rose or a brighter blossom of some sort, with which she would return in triumph. I fancied that sometimes she had to go by night on these charming quests. I could see her businesslike, small figure setting forth down the steep path when she had a good conscience toward her housekeeping and the children were in order to be left. I am sure that her friends thought of her when they were away from home and could bring her an offering of something rare. Alas, she had grown too old and feeble to care for her dear blossoms any longer, and had been forced to go live with a married son. I dare say that she was thinking of her garden that very day, and wondering if this plant or that were not in bloom, and perhaps had a heartache at the thought that her tenants, the careless children, might tread the young shoots of peony and rose and make havoc in the herb bed. It was an uncommon collection, made by years of patient toil and self-sacrifice. I thought of that deserted southern garden as I followed my own New England road. The flower plots were in gay bloom all along the way. Almost every house had some flowers before it, sometimes carefully fenced about by stakes and barrel staves from the miscreant hens and chickens which lurked everywhere, and liked a good scratch and fluffing in soft earth this year as well as any other. The world seemed full of young life. There were calves tethered in pleasant shady spots, and puppies and kittens adventuring from the doorways. The trees were full of birds, the bobolinks and catbirds and yellowhammers and golden robins, and sometimes a thrush, for the afternoon was wearing late. We passed the spring which once marked the boundary where 3 towns met, Berwick, York, and Wells, a famous spot in the early settlement of the country, but many of its old traditions are now forgotten. One of the omnipresent regicides of Charles I is believed to have hidden himself for a long time under a great rock close by. The story runs that he had made his miserable home in this den for several years, but I believe that there is no record that more than 3 of the regicides escaped to this country, and their wanderings are otherwise accounted for. There is a firm belief that one of them came to York, and was the ancestor of many persons now living there, but I do not know whether he can have been the hero of the Baker's Spring Hermitage beside. We stopped to drink some of the delicious water, which never fails to flow cold and clear under the shade of a great oak, and were amused with the sight of a flock of gay little country children who passed by in deep conversation. What could such atoms of humanity be talking about? Old times, said John, the master of horse, with instant decision. We met now and then a man or woman who stopped to give us hospitable greeting, but there was no staying for visits, lest the daylight might fail us. It was delightful to find this old-established neighborhood so thriving and populous for a few days before I had driven over 3 miles of road and passed only one house that was tenanted, and 6 cellars or crumbling chimneys where good farmhouses had been, the lilacs blooming in solitude, and the fields, cleared with so much difficulty a century or two ago, all going back to the original woodland from which they were won. What would the old farmers say to see the fate of their worthy bequest to the younger generation? They would wag their heads sorrowfully, with sad foreboding. After we had passed more woodland and a well-known quarry where for a wonder the derrick was not creaking and not a single hammer was clinking at the stone wedges, we did not see anyone hoeing in the fields, as we had seen so many on the White Rose Road, the other side of the hills. Presently, we met 2 or 3 people walking sedately, clad in their best clothes. There was a subdued air of public excitement and concern, and one of us remembered that there had been a death in the neighborhood. This was the day of the funeral. The man had been known to us in former years. We had an instinct to hide our unsympathetic pleasuring, but there was nothing to be done except to follow our homeward road straight by the house. The occasion was nearly ended by this time. The borrowed chairs were being set out in the yard in little groups. Even the funeral supper had been eaten, and the brothers and sisters and near relatives of the departed man were just going home. The new grave showed plainly out in the green field nearby. He had belonged to one of the ancient families of the region, long settled on this old farm by the narrow river. They had given their name to a bridge, and the bridge had christened the meeting house which stood close by. We were much struck by the solemn figure of the mother, a very old woman, as she walked toward her old home with some of her remaining children. I had not thought to see her again, knowing her great age and infirmity. She was like a presence out of the last century, tall and still erect, dark-eyed and of striking features, and a firm look not modern, but as if her mind were still set upon an earlier and simpler scheme of life. An air of dominion cloaked her finely. She had long been queen of her surroundings and lawgiver to her great family. Royalty is a quality, one of nature's gifts, and there one might behold it as truly as if Victoria Regina Imperatrix had passed by. The natural instincts common to humanity were there undisguised, unconcealed, simply accepted. We had seen a royal progress. She was the central figure of that rural society. As you looked at the little group, you could see her only. Now that she came abroad so rarely, her presence was not without deep significance, and so she took her homeward way with a primitive kind of majesty. It was evident that the neighborhood was in great excitement and quite thrown out of its usual placidity. An acquaintance came from a small house farther down the road, and we stopped for a word with him. We spoke of the funeral and were told something of the man who had died. "Yes, and there's a man laying very sick here," said our friend in an excited whisper. "He won't last but a day or two. And there's another man buried yesterday that was struck by lightning coming across the field when that great shower begun. The lightning stove across his hat and run down all over him, plowed a spot in the ground." There was a knot of people about the door. The minister of that scattered parish stood among them, and they all looked at us eagerly, as if we too might be carrying news of a fresh disaster through the countryside. Somehow, the melancholy tales did not touch our sympathies as they ought, and we could not see the pathetic side of them as at another time. The day was so full of cheer, and the sky and earth so glorious. The very fields looked busy with their early summer growth. The horses began to think of the clack of the oat-bin cover, and we were hurried along between the silvery willows and the rustling alders, taking time to gather a handful of stray-away conserve roses by the roadside, and where the highway made a long bend eastward among the farms, 2 of us left the carriage and followed a footpath along the green river bank and through the pastures, coming out to the road again only a minute later than the horses. I believe that it is an old Indian trail, followed from the Salmon Falls farther down the river, where the up-country Indians came to dry the plentiful fish for their winter supplies. I have traced the greater part of this deep-worn footpath, which goes straight as an arrow across the country, the first day's trail being from the falls, where Mason's settlers came in 1627, built their great works of a sawmill with a gang of saws, and presently a grist mill beside, to Emery's Bridge. I should like to follow the old footpath still farther. I found part of it by accident a long time ago. Once, as you came close to the river, you were sure to find fishermen scattered along. Sometimes I myself have been discovered, but it is not much use to go fishing any more. If some public-spirited person would kindly be the Frank Buckland of New England, try to have the laws enforced that protect the inland fisheries, he would do his country great service. Years ago, there were so many salmon that, as an enthusiastic old friend once assured me, you could walk across them below the falls. But now they are unknown, simply because certain substances which would enrich the farms are thrown from factories and tanneries into our clear New England streams. Good river fish are growing very scarce. The smelts and bass and shad have all left this upper branch of the Piscataqua, as the salmon left it long ago, and the supply of one necessary sort of good cheap food is lost to a growing community, for the lack of a little thought and care in the factory companies and sawmills, and the building in some cases of fishways over the dams. I think that the need of preaching against this bad economy is very great. The sight of a proud lad with a string of undersized trout will scatter half the idlers in town into the pastures next day, but everybody patiently accepts the depopulation of a fine, clear river, where the tide comes fresh from the sea to be tainted by the spoiled stream which started from its mountain sources as pure as heart could wish. Man has done his best to ruin the world he lives in, one is tempted to say at impulsive first thought. But after all, as I mounted the last hill before reaching the village, the houses took on a new look of comfort and pleasantness. The fields I knew so well were a fresher green than before. The sun was down, and the provocations of the day seemed very slight compared to the satisfaction. I believed that with a little more time we should grow wiser about our fish and other things beside. It will be good to remember the White Rose Road and its quietness and many a busy town day to come. As I think of these slight sketches, I wonder if they will have to others a tinge of sadness. But I have seldom spent an afternoon so full of pleasure and fresh and delighted consciousness of the possibilities of rural life. The end.